Welcome to Hardware Asylum. We're once again working on the Scamcase build. I'm going to have to work on that name because the Scamcase has transformed itself into a RestoMod. If you are unfamiliar, the Scamcase started as a mini tower that I got shipped to me from a seller on Macari who thought it was best to ship it in a 40-year-old box without any additional padding or putting the original box into another box. He basically just slapped a label on it, shipped it out, and then called me a scammer when I complained that it showed up damaged. Go figure. As it turns out, from the ashes, I'm putting together a pretty awesome build. It's going to start here with a motherboard from the Hardware Asylum Vault. This is a Socket 5 Pentium. Does not have an AGP slot. Is basically the same style chipset that you would find on a Pentium Pro. This is a Socket 5. I have a Pentium 133 installed. Of course, when I got this motherboard, I didn't realize that it was also damaged. This was when I was a little green in putting computers together. And I believe what I did was I installed an I/O controller to run my hard drive, which gives you serial port access. Whereas on this particular motherboard, you do have parallel, floppy, and two IDE connections on board, along with the serial ports over here. I likely did not use those and used what I had instead, which allowed me to circumvent whatever problem there was on this particular board. Now, when I fired it up to test it off camera, I realized that the processor was only reporting 100 megahertz. And what I suspect happened was when I bought this secondhand from the repair shop, they had the board, they had a processor, they put the processor on the board, and then sent it out. They didn't bother resetting any of the dip switches down here. And with a little bit of ingenuity and some Googling, I was able to find the manual, flip a couple of switches. We got my Pentium 133 to report as a 133. Memory will be 64 megs of EDO 72-pin SIMs. In addition to the motherboard, we're going to be using a Matrox Mystique. This is a first edition Mystique PCI bus. I added an additional 2 megs of memory. I believe it has 4 megs total. It'll be a perfect addition to this particular motherboard, even though it did come out a little bit later. For network, we're going to be using a 3-COM Etherlink 3. It does have the 3 ports. We have the B and C, the pins that nobody ever uses, and an RJ45 jack. This is a 10 base T card, so it's going to be relatively slow, but again, perfect for this particular build. For sound card, I'm going a little above and beyond with the Sound Blaster AW64 Gold. This is an ISA based sound card, so it will fit in the lower sections of this particular motherboard. I did mention that this will be a RestoMod, and the principle of a RestoMod, the way I see it, is to replace the components that are slow and prone to failure with upgraded components. And for that, I'm going to be using an IDE to SD card adapter as my hard drive. I do have a 64 gigabyte Lexar 1667X SD card, super fast. Unfortunately, the system will only recognize 8 gigabytes of this, so that will be the size of my hard drive. Of course, there are ways around that. I could install the XT IDE maybe as a BIOS on this particular card, and that would allow me to unlock the entire SD card in terms of size. But since I'll be running Windows 95, there's really not a need to have much more than 8 gigabytes. And if there is, then it's probably time to upgrade. The last bit I showed you in a previous video, which is also part of the RestoMod process. Up here I have a Silverstone 300 watt SFX power supply that I've modified to add an extra set of Molex plugs, and I've also modified the ATX to AT power adapter to hook into the new power switch that is on the Scamcase. And with all this laid out, let's go ahead and start putting it together. The first task I have is a slight modification to my I/O controller. And as I mentioned, the serial COM ports on the motherboard are not working, so I need to use this particular adapter. But I don't want to take up 2 expansion slots, just so that I can have 2 game ports. So for that, I'm going to swap over to this, which is an independent breakout. Basically going to remove the parallel port from here, remove the parallel port from here and swap it on and plug this cable into the control. So I ran into my first issue as I was getting all this hooked up. I mean, I have the front panel connections hooked into the motherboard, and obviously I changed the fantail on this fan to go onto the heatsink here. And as I was installing the motherboard, the heatsink fan is hitting this part of the hard drive cage, which means I need to go a little bit low profile. I have a few other heatsinks in my collection. I have this heatsink, which is a bit more low profile, which might get us a little bit more space, and I think might be the best bet. And yes, there's no thermal compound on my Intel Pentium because it doesn't need it. To make this work, I basically just need to move the retention clip to the new heatsink and install the fan onto the little blue guy. Clip and clip. Ah, we have just enough space. Here we have the new blue heatsink, and we have just a whisper of room between the fan and the hard drive cage, meaning that this is the proper heatsink. It's considerably smaller than the other one, but it does have a bit more surface area, and as I mentioned before, the Pentium 133 doesn't require a fan as long as you have a fairly large heatsink. Low profile one like this, put a fan on there, it should work just fine. So the first card I will install is basically a sound card. Put that down on the bottom. Next will be the network card. Goes right above it. As I mentioned with the classic case build, if this was supposed to be a vintage mini tower build, it wouldn't be a network card, it would be a modem. But since we don't have dial-up networking, it'd be kind of pointless. Next will be the I/O controller, and I want to leave as many PCI slots open as possible, so that will be in the next slot up. Since the middle one is shared, we want to make sure that we can leave that PCI open for, you know, maybe a voodoo card or something. Next will be the Matrox Mystique. Pretty good card, really. It's not very fast, but at the time it was one of the alternative graphic cards that you could buy that would still actually play some decent games. Next to install will be the SD to IDE adapter. This takes an IDE interface and plugs in an SD card to give you a hard drive. This is a model that I sampled off of Thingiverse and modified extensively. Basically reinforced this and then moved the entire bracket upward to leave room down here for the power cable. What we have to make sure is that there is enough room to get the power there, and also get a cable out to be able to plug into the device. Thing to keep in mind with these adapters is that they work only as the master device, so you can't have more than one device on the IDE chain. Now, of course, if you had IDE hard drives, you could have master and slave, but this one has to run as a master device. And we'll go ahead and run the power to it before we install it. It'll run out like this. Plug this guy in as such. Now with the majority of the expansion cards installed, we can work on drives, external drives that is. So the first will be a 3.5. Fortunately, I am out of TIAC drives that have a white face, so I'm going to have to use a Mitsumi. Also a very good floppy drive. And in some ways the Mitsumi has a better color match than some of the other drives out there. As you can see, the white blends in almost perfectly with the retro-brighted white panels. I am a bit of a loyalist when it comes to floppy drives, and I do like the TIAC 5.25. So we'll go ahead and install one of those. This one has the gray face. Gray was a pretty rare color, although it was made so that it would match well with the IBM PCs. And it just so happens that I have two of these. Let's go ahead and get this cabled up, and then we could try and do a test fire. Alright, now that the drives and all the expansion cards are plugged in, it's a moment of truth. Let's just try it out. Power's on just fine. We have a picture on the screen. We have speaker. And we have Windows 95 Microsoft Plus. I find it interesting that the power supply is near silent. However, the small little 50mm fan on the heatsink is making a heck of a racket. So maybe we'll have to adjust that in the future, but for now I think it is okay. Well, I'm going to call this build a success. We have super fast storage, we have a modern power supply powering the entire system, and we have a plethora of vintage hardware that we can play around with. And all of that is hooked into some vintage components, a few mismatched so they are not period correct, but that is not the point of this particular build. Of course, if you have any questions about what I've done to put together the Scamcase build, please put them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.